As we look again to the U.S. election, early voting remains the big story. 6 days to go until Election Day.
Well, they're making sure their voting equipment is working properly.
And then there's the presidential race. Obviously, no states have yet certified their election results. We have at least 1 or 2 states that are already on track for a recount. And I believe the president may have legal challenges underway in at least 5 states.
We're going through a very challenging time right now. We've just had a very contentious election. And the points of contention really evolve around technology. What technology is being utilized right now to usher in the most significant transition of power in any political process, which is the US elections? So the fact that the voting is being done still with machines that will only read a correct vote if the right pen is used. So clearly, we're not using very sophisticated technology. And then if it was done in person, in a more traditional way, who was allowed to observe the voting and the counting taking place? Every single one of these has been subject to manipulation and under scrutiny for fraud in this US election. So there's 3 different stages to this. You've got voter registration, so assigning an ID with a vote or the ability to vote. And then you have the voting that takes place on the day. And then you have the counting of voting post the election day. What we're discussing is the manipulation of ballot counting. Time is order in all chaos. Every event is a record in time. The birth of a human being is a record in time. Every interaction taken by said human being when alive is a record in time. This is what Bitcoin promises. This is what Bitcoin enables. You can record a birth certificate against the blockchain, and you can record a death certificate against the blockchain. You can have a digital version of a passport against the blockchain. You can have property, land against the blockchain. Everything that you do as a human being in your sovereign capacity can be tracked against a time ledger. For an event as important as who's going to command the largest military force the planet has ever seen, why are we being told that there's been fraud that has taken place in these elections when the whole time we've got the technology to not nullify fraud, to nullify the ability to commit fraud without leaving indisputable evidence? Because it will be vetted and validated within 10-minute windows as opposed to the lag that we're experiencing today, because we're not recording these individual interactions and these movements of events with the timestamps in which they took place in. The reason why it's important to understand the relationship of time when trying to unweave any situation, really, is that the more time there is, the more likely an individual or collective of individuals will be able to cover up their tracks. The more likely that we establish a new normal based upon corrupt foundations before we even knew we had corrupt foundations. Can the blockchain eradicate voter fraud? Short and sweet answer, absolutely. Here's how. So if we look at how voting is done at present, we need to have a degree of witnessing. You go back to any contract you're presented with, you have a signatory, and then depending on what the contract's for, there'll be a requirement of somebody to witness that you signed the contract. Because if it was ever to be disputed, that individual will eventually have to take the stand or in some form of capacity articulate what they did or did not see in order for an adjudication process to take place. Well, the amazing invention of Bitcoin is it makes the whole world the witness because it goes on a public ledger and anyone can scrutinize and see that, okay, this event did take place. So that's the witness side taken care of. But then how do I know it was definitely you? Because the blockchain is meant to be pseudonymous. And it is, meaning that we can see all the interactions that are taking place, but how do I know that it was you? Well, how a child is introduced into the legal world is through a birth certificate. Right? So that's a database again. And if we have a way where our government systems are plugged into this public ledger on a public database that follows you throughout your lifespan on this planet. We do this anyway, but we do it in segmented, fragmented systems. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you blame it on technology. Today, we blame it on maintaining status quo, malevolence, and ill intent, because the excuse of not being able to technically do this is no longer relevant and valid. We've had this technology for 12 years. Quite simply, we're only talking about, can we move our databases from being private and easy to manipulate to this public, impossible to manipulate system? Because that's what we have with this technology. A system of true, global, instant witnesses. So events like fraud will be able to be seen live. If someone is deceased, then their tape ends. If they somehow find themselves in a voting booth, voting for either presidential candidate, and they died 4 years ago, I think that's going to flag a pretty interesting query for someone to look into and say, Mr. John Doe has been dead for 4 years. How are they in the state of Georgia voting for President-elect Biden? Why do we need witnesses? Because we're still doing pen and paper. Why are we using these systems? Because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If this was 30 years ago, no problem. But it's not 30 years ago. We have the solutions, we have the technology. In fact, we have the technology that I'll tell you what the next voting system will be like if Bitstocks built the electoral system. Everyone will be at home, you'll pause your PlayStation or you'll pause your Xbox and say, sorry darling, 1 second, I need to vote on the most important matter on this planet. That is how quick the voting process will be, because you just jump on your iPhone, you load up the government Bitcoin-backed application that your ID is associated with, and then it will come up and you say, who would you like to vote, Michael? President Trump or Biden? And not only will it then make sure my camera appears, is this really you, Michael? Yep, Face ID scanned. It's good enough to secure our financial and our banking system, but it can't secure my vote. Okay, Face ID is not enough. Can you just make sure that it's really you and put your finger on your fingerprint scanner that every single person has, pretty much? Okay, yeah, sure, no problem. Now I've got my fingerprint on it. That completely, utterly will confirm it is me. It will be opened up through the government application, and it will be interlinked with this public ledger along with millions of other services who rely on the integrity of this public system, so the security of it, which, by the way, Bitcoin security has never been compromised in 12 years since it was invented. That's the new voting world. It's an application on the phone that ultimately you can do in between whatever else it is that you're naturally doing as a human being. It can take all of 1 minute. So the fact that we have this inefficient system and we've maintained it for as long as we have, I will question those who are in power who wish to keep their power through means and mechanisms that are not aligned with the people. The end.